Hello. In this screencast, we're going to make the transition from first semester to second semester by talking a little bit about the beginning of the 19th century, known by some as the European century. Needless to say, it starts in Europe, and it starts specifically with this individual, Napoleon Bonaparte. He's our transition between the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the 1800s, the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte is born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which is right here, that little purple island in the Mediterranean. He came from a middle-class background, but it was pretty clear early on what his future was going to be. Corsica was famous for being a military type of culture, and Napoleon knew at an early age that he was going to be involved in it. In fact, there's an anecdote that tells how Napoleon would get beautiful homemade lunches from his mom every day for the trip to school. And yet every day, as he passed the military base on his way to school, he would trade those homemade lunches for dried hardtack, dried jerky, and other army food. His logic was, since he was going to be eating it the rest of his life, he might as well get an early start. By the age of 15, he was attending one of France's top military schools. As an officer in the French army, he was able to defend the Directory from some riots, and by the age of 24, he had become a full-blown general, not just because of his position in the family, but because of his genuine merit. This is something he's going to follow up with as a military commander. In 1799, he achieved a coup d'etat. He decided that the Directory wasn't any use anymore, and he, along with two other generals, took over the Directory. They became a three-person triumvirate, not unlike what Julius Caesar and two other Romans had done way back in the day. Napoleon declared himself first consul, effectively the same title that Julius Caesar had had. Shows you where some of his inspiration came from. By 1804, Napoleon had ended up crowning himself the Emperor of France and the territories that he was starting to conquer. During the ceremony, the Pope was going to hold out the crown for Napoleon to wear, but Napoleon seized the crown from the Pope and took it into his own hands. Pretty good indicator of where Napoleon thought the true power lied in France. Here's a picture of Napoleon as emperor, and if you put him side by side with Louis XVI, remember him from the French Revolution, it's pretty clear that France has really completed the revolution in the sense of a complete cycle. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Napoleon then proceeded to take the ideas of the revolution and put them to work in France and out. At home, Napoleon was famous for inspiring the feeling of nationalism. Remember, if you put ism at the end of a word, you create it as a belief. Nationalism, of course, is the belief in one's nation. For our purposes, and this will be useful in our next unit, we're going to define a nation as a group of people that have a common culture, way of life, and speak a common language. Napoleon also put a lot of the reforms to what's called a plebiscite, or public vote. Again, this was something that not a lot of absolute rulers would do, but being a child more or less of the revolution, Napoleon was willing to put some reforms out there to the public. He reorganized the laws of France into one single code known as Napoleonic Code or simply Code Napoleon. For example, all men were equal. All classes would be taxed. He also created a system of lycées, public schools and universities, opening up more educational opportunities for everybody. He also organized national banks and national currency. With everybody working from the same base economy, he felt he could make France a stronger, more unified country. In government and the army, Napoleon operated on what's called a meritocracy. Positions were based on skill. You didn't get promoted because of your social class, you didn't get promoted because of your family connections. You got promoted simply because you did your job and you did it well. This was something that he transferred throughout his operations and his time in power. In Europe, Napoleon proceeded to conquer between 1800 and 1812 everything here on this map that is in the dark blue. The light blue was under his control, and the pink territories were countries that had allied with him. As you can see, he ended up conquering almost all the European continent, with the exception of Russia and Great Britain. We'll get to them in a moment. As a European conqueror, Napoleon became the founder of what's known as the Romantic movement. Romanticism is an idea that dates back to the stories of knights and kings from the Middle Ages. It's marked by strong feelings, not necessarily boy-girl love stuff, which is what we think of with Romanticism. In Napoleon's case, it was more of everything over the top, everything to the extreme, everything very dramatic. And he inspired a lot of feelings in people this way. It's said that Beethoven's Third Symphony, which is called the Heroic Symphony, was written in his honor. And the Russian composer Tchaikovsky will write the 1812 Overture in memory of Napoleon's campaign against Russia. Pretty impressive when even your enemies will write stuff about you like this. As we said, the two countries that didn't give in to Napoleon were Great Britain and Russia. You'll note, by the way, when we get to World War II, that these are the two countries that are going to give Hitler fits in World War II. Unfortunately for Hitler, he didn't go to school on these two countries because these two are the ones that will bring Napoleon down. So with the addition of land to Napoleon's empire, how does it all come apart? Well, it starts with what was called the continental system. Napoleon figured he couldn't necessarily beat Britain in a direct conflict. So he decided to cut them off from the rest of the continent in terms of trade. He got his allies and his own navy to form a blockade of Great Britain, effectively shut off trade with the British. Unfortunately, it failed in part because it worked. What does that mean? Simple. Because Britain was such a massive trading partner with much of the world, it not only the continental system cut off British trade, but it cut off all trade. And even Napoleon's own allies weren't willing to put up with it if it was going to hurt them in terms of trade and in terms of their economy. So with the failure of the submission of Great Britain, Napoleon then turns his attention to Russia, and in 1812 he launches the most disastrous invasion of his life. He has the largest army the world's ever seen to that point, well over 400,000 troops. If you look at this graphic here in the lower left-hand corner, this band, this tan band, represents the relative size of Napoleon's army. Look at what happens as he marches deeper and deeper into Russia, and look at what happens as the time and temperature start to progress. The Russians were brilliant at winter warfare. They worked on what was called the scorched earth strategy. They simply retreated deeper and deeper and deeper into their own country, destroying resources as they went so Napoleon would not have the resources to support his army. As a result, as summer becomes fall and fall becomes winter, Napoleon's army gets smaller and smaller and smaller, not necessarily because of losing battles, but because his men were simply freezing or starving or getting sick. By the time he literally reaches the outskirts of Moscow, Napoleon is forced to turn back and retreat. This is the black band here. Once again, take a look at how much of an army he's got. At the start, this is his journey into Russia. This is his journey back. If you take a look, 80% of his army is ultimately lost. As we said, some to war, but many more to the cold of winter, many more to disease. With an army that small, Napoleon was ultimately forced to surrender, and he's exiled to the island of Elba, as the rest of the European powers used nationalism to rise up against him. In 1815, Napoleon escapes the island of Elba, lands on the French coasts, and makes an incredible march back to Paris. During this time, Louis XVIII, yes, kids, there was a Louis XVIII, had been restored to the throne of France. Louis sent the army to intercept Napoleon. And in an incredible scene, Napoleon faces off against the army that had one time fought for him. Napoleon steps out in front of his one-time army and says to his army, "If you want to kill me, do so now," and opens up his jacket to show that he's not wearing any kind of armor. With that type of inspiration, the army suddenly abandons working for Louis XVIII, works for Napoleon, and helps him march to Paris, where he puts himself back in power. However, this time, the rest of Europe has decided, no, objects in motion will not be in motion anymore, and after a massive alliance takes down Napoleon at Waterloo, he is sent to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he lives out the remaining 6 years of his life. The picture here at the bottom shows you his tomb, which you can still see if you ever decide to go to Paris. So he is still there. Napoleon's going to have a tremendous impact on European history, because the next 100 years of European history, from 1815 to 1914, will be a process of sorting out what happens after Napoleon's gone. We're going to be taking that up with something called the Congress of Vienna, and we'll be looking at that at the beginning of our second semester.